Good evening. If I could encourage people to take their seats. Good evening. My name is Rosemary Nwama Williams, and I'm the Archbishop of Canterbury's advisor on social and public affairs. On behalf of Archbishop Justin and Caroline Welby, it is my honour and privilege to welcome you all here to Lambeth Palace. We're absolutely thrilled that you're able to be here this evening. We're really excited about what we have in store and hope that you will be too. We've got an evening of conversation and discussion with the Archbishop and Professor Miroslav Volf on the occasion of the launch of the Archbishop's new book, Reimagining Britain, Foundations for Hope. This evening we'll have a chance to hear directly from the Archbishop on his book, where he'll be talking about how he draws on Britain's history and Christian tradition to identify this country's values and explore how they can help equip us as a society for the challenges and the opportunities we face. This evening we're honoured to have Professor Miroslav Volf with us, founder and director of the Yale Centre for Faith and Culture. He will be speaking to us this evening about politics and what matters the most. The Archbishop and Professor Volf will then be in conversation, and there'll be time for questions at the end. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Miss Elizabeth Oldfield. She's the director of Theos, a Christian think tank that exists to enrich the conversation about faith in the public life. Please enjoy the evening, and thank you again for coming.
I've been very obedient and bought layers, so forgive me for pausing to put my blanket down. I am really delighted to introduce our two speakers tonight who we'll hear in conversation in this beautiful room. Our first should need very little introduction. The Most Reverend and Right Honourable Justin Welby was ordained after an 11-year career working in the oil industry. His ministerial training included a theology degree with a specialism in business ethics, a subject he continues to write and speak about regularly. For 20 years, his ministry has blended a deep devotion to grassroots communities with church work around the world, especially in areas of conflict. He spent 10 years serving as a parish priest, has chaired an NHS hospital trust, both of which give you quite a good grounding in conflict, I gather, served as canon of Coventry Cathedral, working internationally on reconciliation, and as Dean of Liverpool Cathedral. In 2011, he became Bishop of Durham, and in 2012, Justin Welby was announced as the 105th Archbishop of the See of Canterbury. Following the Archbishop, we will hear from one of the world's leading theologians, Miroslav Volf. Professor Volf is founder and director of the Yale Centre for Faith and Culture and Henry B. Wright Professor of Theology at Yale University Divinity School. He's written or edited more than 20 books, including Exclusion and Embrace, Allah, a Christian Response, and A Public Faith on how followers of Christ should serve the common good. Professor Volf has also been an active proponent in the Global Agenda Council on Values of the World Economic Forum and served as an advisor as the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships under President Obama. And I look forward very much to hearing from them both. I'm going to hand over to the Archbishop.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for agreeing to moderate this evening, and thank you to those who've prepared this evening and done so much work for this. And thank you to all of you for coming. It's one of those slightly unnerving occasions where you know a lot of people in the audience, and one of the safe things about being an archbishop is you can go somewhere where you know nobody and escape afterwards and not suffer the consequences. So I'm feeling a little more nervous than normal this evening. The book. The book started in a moment of exasperation, really, if I'm completely honest, which may be unwise, after the Brexit vote. Not exasperation so much with the outcome, though plenty of people will have felt that, but with a sense that the dialogue and the way that we were talking about our future as a country just seemed to be missing out on a common vision and a sense of hope. After a book I'd previously written, my first book, which is called Dethroning Mammon, and was a Lent book, I said to my colleagues, if you ever see me start another book, you're entitled to shoot me. As you can see, they regrettably did nothing of the kind. During my summer holiday after the referendum, I wrote about 15,000 words of this book. And then it was a case of I've started, so I may as well continue. And we ended up with a book. The thesis of the book is that from time to time, quite rarely in our history over the last 200 years, I would argue on two previous occasions, that I realize that's going to be a controversial point of view, there is a combination of changes in the way we relate to the world outside us and a combination and the way our economy works and the structures of our society works that calls us to reimagine what kind of country we want to live in, to re-look at our values, to rethink what is this moment and where's it taking us. The first one, I argue, is really from more or less the Great Reform Act in 1832, which incidentally every single bishop in the House of Lords voted against, through to the National Education Act in 1870 and the establishment of state-financed universal primary education. During that time, we had the Mines Acts, the Factory Acts, the end of children going up chimneys, the beginnings of a sense of social obligation. And most importantly, not only was the development in education, there were huge advances in public health, particularly the building of sewers in London and the end of the cholera epidemics. And there was also the beginnings of slum clearance and the beginnings of the building of new housing. The second period, I argue, and if you think about it, it seems to me the two great events that were going on was the development of the Industrial Revolution and also the acquisition of empire, of our next empire, which changed the whole way in which we related to the world in a very significant, substantial way. The next period, I would argue, is after the Second World War, from 1945. The Labour government and the Conservative governments that followed it, and the Labour government after that, right through to the mid-60s. Once again, there was a huge economic change. We were having to rebuild the global economy virtually from scratch after the horrors of the war. There was technological advance resulting from scientific advance in the war, particularly the advent in medicine of antibiotics, and many other significant changes in the way that we work among ourselves. There was huge social change, and that gave rise to economic change, and there was the loss of empire. So foreign policy changed, and we shifted our attention to looking towards Europe. First of all, not very enthusiastically, and then applying and being turned down, and then eventually joining the common market, as it then was. I would argue that today we are at a similar point. Our foreign policy has changed dramatically. We don't know in which direction it's going, but we know in which direction it's come from. It's not that we're abandoning Europe, we're continually reassured on that point, but we have changed our relation dramatically to Europe. The economy is changing extraordinarily rapidly, partly with the after effects of the Great Recession, but also with the sense of the industrial revolution that's going on, the technological revolution, which is not only in AI and robotics, in all the popular and well-known areas, but is also in the development of green energy and in areas arising scientifically out of the deciphering of the human genome. The whole areas of medicine are changing very dramatically. The whole capacity to control and work out what kind of world we're in. And combined with that, the web and particularly social media brings us in contact with people in a way that we are simply incapable of dealing with. We have the information but not the relationships. We know everything and yet don't know how to deal with it. We are lost when it comes to communication, although we have all the information. And the consequence is that, as we know from recent examinations of social media, is that more and more people join groups and become part of social media networks that reinforce their opinions. We create new islands. In one sense, we are becoming re-tribalized in a way that is very dangerous. So foreign policy and economy are changing again. And the history seems to me to, in one way, to some extent, and I realize I'm wildly overgeneralizing, to encourage us to think that if we go through these changes with a clear sense of our values of human beings, of what is important, of how we regard the human being, how we regard the ultimate aims and ends of society, that can consciously or unconsciously set the pattern for redesigning the world in which we live, reimagining our country. If we don't, the changes still happen, but they will happen randomly and in the end, extraordinarily dangerously. They will happen in a way that means that the strong prosper and the weak are lost, neglected, ignored, marginalized more and more. They will happen in ways that will lead to appalling conflict, socially, within social structures, or nationally or internationally. And increasingly, as we've seen over the last 30 years, the fresh outbreak of conflicts between faiths, or which use faith as a hook on which to hang other conflicts, which we strive to deal with. So what do we do about that? We have to look into our past and try and find patterns out of our tradition that enable us to develop a future based in values that are identifiable by ourselves, that ring bells within us, that sound the right tones, even unconsciously in our society. Part of that, I would argue, in this country, the greatest part of that springs from a Christian tradition, not practiced so much nowadays. The majority of people now saying they don't believe in God, they don't have any faith, any religion, and yet still implicitly using expressions or concepts that come from a Christian tradition. We still talk about being a good Samaritan. We still talk about loving your neighbor. We still respect people who do those kind of things. We still talk about self-sacrifice as a virtue. We see humility as a good thing, and so on and so forth. You could go on for a long time. One of the key parts of the book is picking up on a dictum of Burke's in his essay on the French Revolution. I'm not quoting exactly, but in which he says the social contract, effectively, he says the social contract is a covenant between those who've lived in the past, those who are alive today, and crucially, he ends, those who are yet to be born. It's fascinating that he put that, because in our day, it has suddenly become extraordinarily important. That last bit, I'll come back to that in a moment. But what is underlying that dictum of Burke's is that traditions don't do paradigm shifts. They don't suddenly jump from one place to another without connection. That living traditions change adapt, if they don't change and adapt, they die. But if they do great leaps where there's no connection with the past, there is no solidity to them. We cannot live in a world which says that once you've done something twice, it's a tradition, or from next Monday it will be the tradition not to walk on the grass, or things like that. It doesn't work that way. People don't work that way. They dig into things in their past and hold on to them for the future. One of my great heroes is Archbishop William Temple, and I don't compare the book to his great book, Christianity and Social Order, in any way at all. But in that book, he both draws on tradition, but also makes extraordinarily prescient and demanding claims on what society should look like. And that was written during the Second World War, arising out of his friendship with Tawney, the great socialist, Christian socialist philosopher, political philosopher, and also Beveridge, a childhood friendship. Beveridge, who wrote the Beveridge Report, designing effectively the welfare state in the post-war period. Temple spoke actively of intermediate institutions, and that's the last of the great concepts I want to bring up today, because it's something I picked up. For Temple, the intermediate institution was the thing that lies between the individual and the state. It's where you practice what it is to be virtuous, to live as you should in society. It's small enough that you can identify with one another, and big enough that it tests your willingness to be altruistic, to care for others. In Temple's day, he talked about schools and churches. I add to that list businesses, which he would not have seen as intermediate institutions, but if you go to Catholic social teaching and one of John Paul II's encyclicals, he defines businesses as enterprises of common and community interest. In other words, people belonging to each other. So what kind of values does the book pick up, finally? It picks in 3, and I'm oversimplifying a couple of chapters. First, those things that stick us together. Cohesion, I call it. What is it that holds us together? And that draws very heavily on Catholic social teaching, which itself, of course, draws very deeply on the Christian tradition, on the scriptures, and the development of Christian thinking, particularly since Leo XIII in the 1890s. But continued until this day with Pope Francis, with the Laudate Si, which was so influential at COP21 in Paris. Secondly, what drives us forward? It seems to me one of the problems with some aspects of Catholic social teaching is they're about what holds us together and makes us cohesive as a society, but they could leave us going nowhere. What drives us forward? And I have a group of things which I cast in the area of courage, arising out of competition, out of aspiration, that draw us to try and create creativity itself as virtues which come out of not entirely always a Christian tradition, although very often, but also come out of our experience of the last 200 years and our scientific development, industrial development in this country. And thirdly, what are those things that enable us to cope in times of trouble? Resilience, sustainability. And I suggest that too springs out of our Christian tradition. The capacity of Job for endurance, the capacity in the New Testament of Paul to suffer, in fact, the very suffering and passion of Jesus himself. So those are the 3 blocks of virtues, and in most of the book I reflect more or less badly on a number of areas. I've talked about housing, education and health. Both after 1945 and in the 19th century, those were the areas that were addressed, where you change society most effectively. They still are. Health today must include social care, it must include mental health, and we must go back to treating public health as important and essential. Education, I won't develop that chapter, it's in the book. And housing, we all know the difficulties and the crises there are there. But I add to that things that Temple didn't particularly need to deal with: immigration and integration, the changing nature of the economy, the very rapidly changing nature of the household and family, foreign policy. Are we inward-looking or outward-looking? Do we engage beyond our borders? And with what values, with what aim? And finally, of course, the environment, that great test, which I was reminded of in Fiji a couple of weeks back with the archbishops of the Pacific region of the Anglican Communion, as one of them said to me, "For you it's a theory, for us it's a lived and dangerous reality." And that is more or less what I'm putting forward in the book. And with that, I will hand over to Miroslav Volf.
Archbishop Justin, oh my goodness, thank you. You think I'll be able to speak? I'm not sure. Archbishop Justin, bishops, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Globally, religions are growing, and growing in absolute and relative terms. And in good democratic fashion, their adherents insist on being present and active in the public square. The continued vibrancy and political assertiveness of religions is both an unresolved problem and a missed opportunity for religions themselves, but also for the world at large. It is a problem because religions continue to legitimize abuse, violence, and war on large scale, but it is a missed opportunity because at their heart, religions are more or less compelling visions of the good life and of human journey toward it. Now tonight, I will zero in on the opportunity, and I will limit myself to the contribution that the Christian faith has to make. This is also a focus of the book whose publication we are celebrating tonight. His Grace has forbidden him to call him His Grace. So Justin has sketched a Christian political vision, but more importantly, he courageously and cheerfully takes up concrete and pressing issues such as immigration and housing, economy, education, and transformation of families. Whether on the mountaintop casting a vision or on the ground helping to solve concrete problems, in reimagining Britain, he seeks to awaken hope, expand the sphere of solidarity, and generate courage. In the process, he succeeds in turning the present crisis and disorientation into an impetus for imagining a new future for individual citizens and for the nation as a whole. Now, I was invited not so much to offer a review of Reimagining Britain, but to more generally speak about the role of faith in the public square. I will explore some basic concerns that inform both Christian political vision and wrestling with concrete issues. And what I will talk to you about is something that I myself, with a group of scholars at Yale Center for Faith and Culture, have been working on over the past few years, and something that has been also generally supported by MacDonald Agape Foundation as well as by Templeton Foundation. So what I will do, I will first take up what I call contemporary forgetfulness about what matters the most. I mean by that a vision of authentic human flourishing, a way of leading one's life well, a way of life going well, and way of feeling right in their unity. I will then explore three sets of relations central to Christian account of flourishing life, both personal and national. put them a little bit more abstractly, I will deal with the relation between particular and universal. Second, between mundane and transcendent. And then finally, and somewhat closer to the ground, between striving and joy. But first, let me name 3 assumptions I bring to the endeavor. And before I do that, I should say that I was mentioning that I was part of the Global Agenda Council, Councils of World Economic Forum, and I participated early after the big economic crisis of the past decade. I participated in Global Redesign project. Klaus Schwab came with that idea of having something like global redesign. I remember distinctly talking about the global redesign and asking myself the question, one thing we are not putting on the table is what we are redesigning global institutions for. And it would seem to me that if you don't know what you're redesigning something for, you aren't going to quite succeed in redesigning what you seek to redesign. So first, let me just mention briefly my assumptions, and then I'll go into the meat of what I want to say. First, there are 2 prevalent options about the role of religion in public life. One is something like a secular exclusion of religion from public square, and the other is kind of religious domination of the public square. Both of these are unworkable, and they're also morally unacceptable. Each of these stances generates the other as a reaction, and both are oppressive. The first toward religious people, and the second toward all those who don't espouse the dominant form of religion. Second, the Christian faith, and I think the other religions as well, Christian faith has its own good reasons to advocate political arrangements that avoid both secular exclusion of religion and religious self-imposition upon the unwilling. Christians have, in fact, invented political pluralism. In fact, I think 2 Londoners have done that. One, of course, who had to flee to Amsterdam to sketch his vision, and the other one who had to travel to United States, to then colonial America, to Rhode Island to establish that. One was Thomas Helwys, and the other one was Roger Williams. But one can argue that the moral principles, which are the foundation of political pluralism, freedom of religion and our religion, and equal moral value of all, are bedrock of Christian moral teaching. Much of the Christian faith speaks in favor also of 2 operative modes of political pluralism: a clear distinction between religion and rule, and the impartiality of the state. Now, the operative modes, we may disagree, and we may talk more about those. Third, and perhaps most controversial assumption that I make, is that I believe that alternative religious visions of good life, visions, by the way, which contend with one another for intellectual plausibility and for social power, that these religious visions are indispensable in modern world. They're not like antiquated Viking ships on which humanity used to sail to cross ocean of life before invention of modern jets. The reason is simple. The sciences are inadequate for articulating a vision of the good life. Scientific research, fantastic, amazing tool, is driven by purposes and values, but cannot set purposes and define values. It can tell us a lot, for instance, about what humans tend to desire and why, but it can tell us nothing as to what they ought to desire and what kind of life is truly worth desiring. This is what I think is a significant contribution of great religious tradition, certainly of the Christian faith, to bring forth the long tradition of reflection on what is truly human life. So let me first make a few comments about life and resources for life, about account of flourishing. As many see today, human purposes and values and the vision of the good life itself are not matters of truth and falsehood, but matters of individual preference and dreams. In the domain of purposes and values, we are free to follow our dreams, they think, provided we do no harm to others. Indeed, if we didn't do so, if we didn't follow our dreams, we would betray our authentic humanity. A good life is a private, personal matter, it is understood. But, interestingly enough, preconditions for good life are not. Secure the resources you might need for living your dream, whatever that might be. This is the overruling imperative of modernity, writes sociologist Hartmut Rosa. Whatever you may end up choosing as your good in the course of your life, you will be better off if you have accumulated economic, social, cultural, and bodily capital. In other words, if you are rich, educated, well-connected, and good-looking. From kindergarten to hospice, learning how to secure resources and going about securing those resources claims most of our time and energy. But something is off with this account of the relation between the good life and the resources we need to secure it. Rosa expresses what's wrong with this with the help of an image. In a way, we moderns resemble a painter who is forever concerned about improving his materials. The colors and brushes, the air conditioning in the studio and lighting, the canvas and easel, but never really starts painting. Christian faith, in a sense, too, is about resources, about food, clothing, shelter, health. Whether we care for the hungry, for the sick, for the exposed, for the powerless, or fail to do so, will largely determine the verdict of the ultimate judge, what kind of verdict the ultimate judge will pass on our lives. But Christian faith is also about what matters more than resources we need to survive and thrive. This is, in fact, the most important contribution that Christian faith can make to the public life. It tells us that the good life is the pearl for which it is worth selling any resources we might have. Health, wealth, power, fame, or pleasure. With that pearl, it also tells us, we receive back improved much of what we have sold to acquire it. Without that pearl, we ourselves are diminished and lost, and none of the things we refuse to sell in order to acquire it can make up for the damage. Let me now turn to the three sets of relations, and I'll present them in a kind of three interrelated vignettes. And one of them is about relationship between particular and universal. As Justin has argued in his book also, the scope of our solidarity these days seems to be shrinking. We have, of course, always cared above all for ourselves and our own, for our tribes, our communities, and more recently also for our nations. But today we seem to do so increasingly without bad conscience. Take the resurgence of nationalism as an example. Only a decade ago, tribalism seemed a marginal phenomenon. But globalization processes, though by no means only negative in impact, have resulted in extraordinary discrepancies of wealth and power, progressive ecological devastation, and loss of sense of personal, cultural, religious, and national identities. In reaction, nationalist sentiments have conquered the world. Now, Christian faith is a universalist creed. The one God is the creator, redeemer of the whole world. The singleness of the garden at the beginning of the biblical story of God's relation to humanity matches the singleness of the city, New Jerusalem, at the end. And in the middle is the story of Jesus Christ and God's universal rule. Christian faith addresses all human beings and aims at the good of all human beings. Since the world is the object of God's care, I think Christian faith is incompatible with exclusive nationalism, divorced from universal moral commitments and operating on principle of international exceptionalism. Like family or neighborhood, a good nation is a form of special relations, rooted in history, language, or place. These more proximate relations center our care without taking away its universal scope. As one loves oneself and one's family without ceasing to love all neighbors, so one loves one's own nation in community of all nations. As Christians understand it, God doesn't only care for the whole, God cares for each human being. All humans and all life on the planet are interdependent and an interconnected ecology of relatedness. For one person to truly flourish, the entire world must flourish. For the world to truly flourish, every person must flourish. And for every person and the entire world to flourish, each in their own way and all together must live and see themselves as living in the presence of life-giving God. I come to my second vignette. It's called The Bread and the Word. Turn these stones into bread. The tempter taunted Jesus, famished after a 40-day fast in the wilderness. Jesus resisted, responding, "One does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." Now, Jesus was quoting Hebrew Bible. These words came first to the children of Israel as a summary of the main lesson they were to have learned in the course of 40 years of wandering in the wilderness before entering the promised land. They did need bread in wilderness. That much was never in doubt. That truth, as insistent as a growling stomach, they didn't need to learn. But that they needed more than bread, that truth, not as obvious as hunger, but as real as the possibility of missing on our human purpose, that truth they did need to learn. All humans do, perhaps especially we moderns. We have made our greatest temptation into the chief goal of our lives and the main purpose of our major institutions, whether economic, political, or educational. Most of our social and individual energy and imagination revolves around turning stones into bread. And yet, we, both the rich and the poor, are still in the wilderness, plagued by hunger and by thirst. For when we live by bread alone, there is never enough bread. Not enough even when we make so much of it that most of it rots away. When we live by bread alone, someone always goes hungry. When we live by bread alone, every bite we take leaves a bitter aftertaste, and the more we eat, the bitter the taste is. When we live by bread alone, we always want more and better bread, as if the bitterness came from not having tasty enough bread and not from living by bread alone. Living by mundane realities and for them alone, we remain insatiably restless, and that restlessness in turn contributes to competitiveness, social injustice, and destruction of the environment. It also constitutes a major obstacle to more just, generous, and caring personal practices and social arrangements. Now, but you might ask, but why won't bread alone? Why won't the unending stream of amazing goods and services we generate with such incredible ingenuity? Why won't this still our hunger and open us up to delight? Perhaps we just need to make work more meaningful, pay fair wages, and meet basic needs. Now, economic justice of this sort would help immensely, I think. And yet, even with justice secured, joy may elude us. Which brings me to my next vignette. Striving and Rejoicing is its title. Now, affirmation of the ordinary life, celebration of work, family, quotidian pleasures. Affirmation of ordinary life is one of the central features of the modern era. Paradoxically, perhaps, the central problem of that same modern era is the alienation of the world from the self and the self from the world. Now, different thinkers characterize this alienation in different ways, but many of them agree on this. Karl Marx speaks of alienation. Martin Heidegger speaks of homelessness. Sigmund Freud speaks of narcissistic ego and its impossibility to fit in the world as it is. They all name indifference and hostility between human beings and their lived world. Now, much of our alienation much of this kind of alienation comes from the fact that the world, as a matter of fact, is and can be a pretty hostile place. Many today experience economic and political systems as working against them rather than working for them. A sense of alienation is magnified by inner pressure for each of us to achieve ourselves as persons. Now, as we understand ourselves, we moderns, we think of ourselves as sovereign individuals, owners of ourselves and of our action, and we struggle for recognition in the context of competition and in the world in which almost everything is possible and almost nothing is prohibited. There's no way to win the game of self-achievement in such an environment. No wonder that many of us, even very high achievers, are depressed. We cannot remember when we last truly rejoiced. But perhaps more basic reason for alienation and for lack of joy is the loss of gratitude. Let's imagine a world in which we have a deeply meaningful work, perhaps a garden to till and to keep if you are into agriculture, horticulture, or whatever. Relations with our family and friends could not be better. Nobody is there to boss us around. I'm imagining a world, right? Nobody's there to boss us around. There's no structure to impose itself upon us like some iron cage. Imagine that the land is fertile, that the climate is mild, and that we live in abundance. In such an environment, you might think joy would come unbidden. But imagine also that on the mound in the middle of the garden, visible from everywhere we happen to be, there is a tree bearing what seems to be exceptionally attractive fruit. And we are hindered from harvesting it. That one tree, desired all the more because access to it is barred and because the taste of it is unknown, that one tree becomes the pearl of great price for which we are willing to risk everything. Economist Thomas Sedlacek, Czech economist Thomas Sedlacek, has made story of Adam and Eve a lesson in the impossibility of joy. Now, I'm not sure that he's right about the impossibility, but I think his main point can be put slightly differently, and it stands. We can be in paradise and still deeply malcontented. Every paradise has a tree in it that we cannot fully access. More, Whatever we think is paradise will undo itself if we fail to genuinely celebrate the good that it represents and only stretch ourselves towards something we do not yet have. Now, I know that somebody might object. I sometimes object to myself when I say something like that. Well, let's not invoke paradise too quickly. Many people live today in an earthly hell while watching a tiny few wallow in paradisiac opulence. Create first paradise for all, the objector may continue, and we'll deal with the problem of joy once we are in the paradise. Fair enough. Except that the objection misses the main point. What prevents anything like paradise from appearing in the first place is the inability to celebrate the goodness on the road to it. Our economy is largely joyless. Our education is joyless. Our politics are joyless. Our entertainment, though full of wonderful humor, is joyless. Our pleasures, intense and many, are nevertheless joyless. In all these spheres, our sense of world's perfectibility and our natural insatiability, the competitiveness also that marks our societies, all of these things conspire to undermine our ability to rejoice in the goods that are already ours. We rejoice over things when we perceive as good and which come to us as unowed. A basic Christian conviction is that the world, even the flawed world, is a gratuitous gift from God of love. When we receive the world and all that is good in it as a gift, we rejoice. According to Genesis, God created the world in 6 days, each day's work producing something good. And on the 7th day, God rested. 6 days, humans should work as well. And on the 7 days, we should cease working and pause to celebrate the good that God and we in collaboration with God have produced. On that day of the week, a day toward which all days are aiming and from which they all gain meaning, human striving is to come to a halt. And joy in the world and in God as the giver is to reign supreme. On that day, we don't go through things of ordinary life to take delight in some deeper eternal beauty and goodness in itself. Rather, we come to experience ordinary things as extraordinary, as lovers, gifts, and therefore rejoice in them all the more. I'm with Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. If I ruled the world, I'd resign immediately. That's what he wrote. But before resigning, I would enact one institution that has the power to transform the world. It's called the Sabbath. God does rule the world, and God did establish Sabbath, no matter how we Christians negotiate around this, and there are ways to do so, but let me put it without sounding overly legalistic, the point that I want to make. Let us set time every day, a day every week, a week or more every year, to rejoice in the good that already is ours. On such occasion, we would find ourselves closer to paradise than any riches can ever provide for us. Let me conclude. The most important political question of our time is the one we tend to think isn't political at all. Who are we? You and I and the nations to which we belong. What kind of human beings and what kind of nation should we aspire to become? Now, we have a legitimate interest in affirming our identity and protecting our boundaries, the boundaries of our habitations, personal and national. But we diminish ourselves when we disdain the good that those unlike us might represent and refuse to share our goods with those in dire need. We love ourselves and our communities the best when we do so within the scope of a commitment to flourishing of all people and everywhere. We need goods and services to live flourishing lives. But life is more than resources for life, more than sum of accumulated things and experiences. No matter how wealthy we are individually and collectively, we are small when we live by bread and for bread alone. Neither we nor our neighbors will truly flourish on bread alone. To try to do so is to build our individual and national or collective future on foundation of sand rather than rock. For most of us, life isn't the way it's supposed to be. And it isn't the way it's supposed to be even when we live in abundance and safety. Life, therefore, is about achievement and striving, but gift is more basic than achievement. And joy is more basic than striving. For each of us individually and for all of us together, there is no greater good than the true life. The life that Christians believe is found in trusting and loving God, caring for our neighbors and the creation, and delighting in the beauty, the truth, and goodness that already are ours. Let me end now by saying that I'm grateful to Justin for the book Reimagining Britain. For me, its chief contribution is that in a time of global uncertainty about national identities, worsening environmental degradation, and huge imbalances in wealth, education, and power, he dared to take up afresh and very concretely the question of what does it mean today to be a good nation. May this book open up a fresh conversation about who we are and what kind of individual and national life we should aspire to. Thank you.
Archbishop, Professor, thank you so much. I want to start with a big one, really. Archbishop, you argued that the last time we'd undertaken the kind of level of reimagining required, we were at war, or we were coming out of a war. And you've painted a very inspiring picture of potential, but quite a bleak picture of where we are now in terms of joyless systems, institutions oriented away from the things that help us flourish. So what would it take to give us the urgency to make the deep changes that are required? And how hopeful are you both?
That's for Justin. Beyond my pay grade.
Certainly beyond mine. I think, well, the book is called Foundations for Hope. I think one of the things I think we wrestle with more than anything else in our country at the moment is lack of hope. Hope is what enables you to endure and to survive and to push forward and to see what can be in the future. One of the greatest changes in my lifetime is people beginning to think that their next generation will be less well off than they are, rather than better off. Sense of lack of development. So I think the creation of hope and that for me has to come by a creation of a narrative, and that can about who we are and what we're for. And it needs to be an aspirational narrative, an ambitious narrative, not depending on state action or on the individual alone in a howling desert, but on the individual working with others in these intermediate transactions and in collaboration with the state where that is appropriate. But that requires leadership politically, economically, from business, from faith groups for that matter, and at a national and local level, which is the big challenge if we do not have confidence in the future. So it comes down to me for the creation of hope through leadership. And that gives that sense of urgency, of desire for the flourishing that we seek.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would simply add that sometimes it seems to me that we need something like a crisis in order to wake us up from the direction in which we are going. Of course, all the time we sense that there are anomalies, that things aren't quite working well, but as long as we have a confidence that things are simply moving on their course with little glitches that we can repair along the way, we're not quite ready for reimagining, for redesigning. And once the engine stops or starts really seriously sputtering, then we ask the larger question of how might we do better, where we have gone wrong. And I'm hoping that the moment of crisis, and in some sense, even when we want to deny it, we are in a crisis, that moment will be a moment of reawakening and asking the question anew. And the key is, of course, in a crisis to remain hopeful, to continue to have it. If you don't have hope, obviously, nothing's going to move forward.
And where there's no hope, people respond from fear. And I think this is what we're seeing in much of the nationalism, the populism. And that sense of fear is utterly destructive and will lead to us doing terrible things to each other. Yep. It's hope that comes from a sense of anger. That seems paradoxical, but when we look round and when you look at rough sleepers, when you look at communities that seem to be excluded from the economy, when you look at areas where things are not going well, when you look at the breakdown in many relationships, that sense that things should not be like that can be combined with hope to make a change.
Thank you. You've both spoken very persuasively about why Christian thought can make a contribution. I want to press you on it because often the way that's framed is, in some sense, backward-looking because of who we are, because of where we've come from. Given we've acknowledged that a majority of people in this country would call themselves non-religious, given that, forgive me, some of what you said about the love of God and the gift of creation from God will just sound like nonsense to some people outside these walls and probably to some people even in this room. What is the forward-looking reason why Christian voices, Christian perspectives in our public life have something to offer still?
Well, so my sense is that there are many accounts or visions of flourishing life, the good life, true life, life worth living. You can put different tags on this, on offer. I think what I find disconcerting is that so I put it sometimes this way. We used to treat great philosophical traditions and those who represented them, or great religious traditions and those who represented them, as kind of nutritionists of our lives. So they'll tell us what is good for us to eat, what not, and how to lead our lives in a way that will kind of be conducive to our flourishing. These days, I think we can kind of shift it to looking at them as waiters in a restaurant. They bring us food that we've ordered. We see a menu here, they bring us food, and we expect them to know something about what they're bringing to us, but we are not expecting them to have a strong opinion of what's really good for us. We want to eat what we like. And we are happy that when we have satisfied our appetite for what we like. And we treat various options as matters of taste. And I think that what we need, there will be people who disagree with Christian vision of the good life, but what we need is a robust and truth-seeking conversation about what constitutes the good life. I think the sciences, as I've tried to argue, cannot provide us with this. What we need is the great traditions who have tested their reflection on what constitutes a good life over the centuries and bring forth as their claim to true life. And then we can debate those things and argue in a space that is very contested. You know, at Yale I teach a course called Life Worth Living, and we have about 6-7 different traditions that we engage there. It's very interesting what one of the students said when he was kind of been aware how rich these traditions were. And he said, you know, these people have thought deeply about these issues for millennia, and I'm supposed to decide what's a good life in the course of an afternoon or even in the course of one individual course. And so I think what I would want us to invite is for these rich traditions to be put on the table and engage in a sturdy debate without presuming the truth of Christian faith or other faiths, as a matter of fact, but presuming that they make claim to it, and we should engage them seriously. And I think, just add very briefly, I think it's that our lives are going to be the most compelling witness to the truth of the claims that we make.
I think that last point, particularly picking up that last point, I think one of the things we have in the 21st century, as opposed to not looking back, looking forward, is not only the description of a life worth living, the description of abundant life, to use the phrase we use in life in all its fullness, that we use in our education system, in the church education system. But I think it's community as opposed to isolation speaks to people. And it's being the icons of Jesus who washed feet rather than of the religious leaders who lay down laws which they themselves ignore.
Thank you. You've both spoken in different ways in different parts of your writing about love in politics. You've spoken about solidarity today. Archbishop, in your book, you say that good societies reflect love in action, the active pursuit of the well-being of others without seeking return. The classic modern political philosophies tend to be a bit more pragmatic than that and see the key human driver as self-interest and then try and work out ways to channel that in better directions. Isn't asking people to pursue the good of others without seeking return just a little bit too much of a high bar?
Well, without seeking any return, maybe too much of a bar, right? High bar. But I'm not. So I think there are kind of levels of what we may be ready to give in terms of loving relationships. The supreme act of love, we have always thought, is giving one's life for others. But I tend to think that every time we want to impart a bit more than we expect to receive in return, we've given a gift. A small gift, maybe a little bit insignificant of a gift, but it's a gift nonetheless. And I would want to make an argument that actually we cannot be good parents, we cannot be good doctors, we cannot be good teachers, we cannot be good clergy, we cannot be good lawyers, maybe. We cannot be good businessmen. I think unless we're, as a matter of fact, giving slightly bit more than what we expect to receive in return. And when the return comes, it is a gift that is, in a sense, a bonus that's received and not a reason why we engage in that activity.
There's Paul Ricoeur talks at one point about the difference between exchange and equivalence and abundance and grace. And Pope Benedict picked this up in one of his encyclicals when he talked about the need for gratuity, which is exactly what, Miroslav, what you've just said. that little bit extra more than we hope to get back as being an essential part of human interaction, that we don't live on equivalence and exchange. And if I was worried about one particular thing in politics at the moment, not necessarily in this country, but arguably in perhaps where you live, it's the...
I'm moving.
We can offer asylum. It's that sense that everything has to be transactional.
Thank you. Professor Volf, you spoke really eloquently, and I was very moved by your description of the human experience of estrangement. Different people call it different things: alienation, a sense of homelessness in the world, disconnection from other people, which feels like it resonates very strongly with our political condition. So how much should or can personal, spiritual, psychological renewal play a role in our broader political imagining? How much is it a precondition of that?
That's a tough question. So I think it can play a great role. My own thinking about it is shaped by my father's coming to faith after 3 months of a death march, and about 2 months in a terrible labor camp where he thought any moment that his soul would leave his body. And somehow he came to accept the love of God as something real for him. And absolutely nothing changed, but for him everything changed at that moment. And that's not an argument to keep the death marches and labor camps going. It's a statement that actually we can discover the beauty of the world even in the midst of very difficult circumstances. And we can experience this in many situations. So I think that would be for me the first thing to say, to trust I would say the presence of the Spirit of God, to trust the beauty of the human spirit. You can put it in very, very different ways, that the goodness that is there will blossom. But then also to think about what can we do in terms of our institutions, in terms of ways in which we organize our lives, in order to support this sense of feeling that we are and can be at home rather than in this hostile, alienating environment. I think it has a very intensely personal and also kind of social dimension, transformative dimension, for me at least.
I think that's very moving, hearing that. It seems to me to point towards both the need for a deep sense of the eternal relationship with God, but also the need for relationality, for being in relationship with other people. About 3 years ago, I was in a refugee camp near Goma in the DRC. And there was a tent there that was for children with disabilities. It was on a lava base, so it was very hard and rocky and horrible. And for various reasons, supplies to the camp had broken down, and so there were no medicines, and the children were dying very rapidly and in large numbers, who had mostly not been able to be cared for by their parents on their own, often death marches to get to that camp through militia-held areas. It was a terrible place. And yet within it, there was a charity, medical charity working from South Africa, that with nothing in their hands was still relating to and loving those children as they died. It was a terrible place. It was a great evil that was happening. And yet one saw something of human determination to maintain love and compassion in places where there was no possible advantage to do so. And that somehow challenged the alienation that was seen.
Thank you.
And it was very powerful.
Let's get a bit practical and institutional for a moment.
I'm an archbishop, I don't do practical. Pass it to the professor.
The book belies that.
Yeah, there we go.
Archbishop, you lead an established church.
Do I?
And Professor...
It worries them as much as it worries me.
Guy.
Well, I want to push on that a little bit, because you spoke about the impartiality of the church.
Of the state. Of the state.
Okay. You alluded to a relationship between church and state with some degree of separation.
Yes.
This is my journalistic background coming out. I want to see where there's disagreement. What should the relationship be between the church and the state for them to both work to their full potential to serve the common good? Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll just say just a tiny bit. I think I am kind of a disestablishment guy, but on the other hand, I think that together with Charles Taylor, I try to differentiate between the moral principles and operational modes of something like a pluralistic democracy. The moral principles are freedom of religion and our religion and equality of all human beings. Operational modes are something like the separation and distinction, right? I'm happy with distinction only in some circumstances, and also certain form of impartiality of the state. Now, how that's negotiated concretely and what a particular history of a people suggests that be done and how best to achieve that, I think we have to honor particularities of the situation. So I'm trying reconciling.
That was very diplomatic.
Yeah. But it's true.
I think, particularly in a public gathering, were I to argue for disestablishment, it would probably be a public relations mistake. And I wouldn't want to in any way. I think one of the things that we found in this country with the established church is a mode that is operationally distinct, very much distinct, and yet is in covenant terms and in historical terms integral to our understanding of what is good for the state in England. Obviously, it doesn't apply in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, where disestablishment happened a long time ago. And but the established church somehow finds through establishment a concern that has become deeply embedded within it and has other reasons as well, for every human being within England. Not just for the ones who are part of the established church, not only for the ones who are of any who have any faith, including ones who are of no faith. When Jewish groups are attacked, it is the calling and role of the established church to stand up for them. When mosques are attacked, it is the role of the established church, so that when there was the attack on the mosque in Finsbury Park last summer, I went up there very quickly and found that the Bishop of Stepney had got there before me. And so, poor things, they were they were dealing with the aftermath of a very horrible event, and found they were stuck with the Bishop and Archbishop, which may not have helped. And, but that was typical, that was part of the responsibility. So operationally, there is a concern and a care expressed in love. Legally, there is a linkage which expresses itself in the role of the supreme governor.
And the moral principles of equality have been respected.
There is no questioning of the moral principles of equality.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you. This is my final question before opening up to the floor. So this is your 2-minute warning for those of you who need some time to gather your thoughts. I'm going to ask you both to say one policy proposal, and it may be instantiating the Sabbath or maybe something else. This is that government could take practical action on. Archbishop, you've covered prisons, you've covered housing policy, you've covered family policy in your book. If you could only have one, if you could only see progress in one area, that would move us forward towards a more flourishing society, what would it be?
So I'll give up on my one, and we'll let Archbishop have two.
You're not allowed to gang up.
That is two hostages to fortune. The first one would be government getting off the back of intermediate institutions and looking carefully to make sure that they can flourish and work well.
Just to unpack what you mean by intermediate institutions.
Anything from local clubs, groups, interest groups, through companies, small companies, things that draw people together and places where they practice and learn values of gratuity, of generosity, of grace in a common endeavor, whether for the common good or should always be for the common good, but sometimes in a business, including with profit or in not-for-profits, as happens to be the case. The second one, well, I've got so many in there, it's really a bit worrying. I think the second one is in order to facilitate the debate we need about who we are and how we are, a strengthening of our freedom of speech and a strengthening, which was talked about recently by the Minister for Universities at the time, of defence of people being able to speak even if they cause offence.
Thank you. Great. Now it's your turn.
I'll say one quickly.
Yes, do.
Especially for the United States. I think I would want to at least double the minimum wage. It's a scandalously low in the United States.
I talk about that in there, so that's
Yeah.
right. I've had that one. So
Your copy's
I'm just
here.
feeling guilty now.
Forgive me, that was a bit mean. I didn't warn you about that one. Yes, now over to you. I am going to take questions in clusters of 3. Please note the word questions. Keep them concise as you possibly can and say your name, because it's really nice to know what human being we are talking to. So there is one hand up at the back. A couple more questions we can take following that. The gentleman in the middle. And just to make the poor mic rovers work, the gentleman in the second row back on the far end.
Thank you very much. My name's Gareth Wallace. I'm the director of the Conservative Christian Fellowship. When I'm together with my ecumenical political colleagues in the other party Christian fellowships, we actually quote the Archbishop on disagreeing well. So I just wondered any reflections on how well politicians are disagreeing at the minute and how we might be able to disagree better.
Thank you. Gareth on disagreeing well. Gentleman in the middle.
Charles Moore, I'm sorry to lower the tone slightly, but the Archbishop did say that he was prompted in writing his book by Brexit. And I wondered what he meant by that. And in particular, I wanted to ask whether the atmosphere in this room and from the panel is one of disapproval of so-called populism and nationalism, rather than of understanding why such things might be in the air. Mrs. Clinton used the phrase a basket of deplorables to describe all the people she didn't like in her own country. And I feel that, and I ask whether such people are identified as Brexiteers by the establishment, not only in the church sense, but the establishment in general, and that there should be much greater recognition of why there is a revolt against the establishment.
Thank you. Charles on nationalism and populism.
The pearl beyond price was presented tonight, a very important theme, but I think Professor Miroslav Volf seemed to be centering on it as an individual quest, primarily. My question is, how practical or impractical is it to say that nations should go for a pearl beyond price as part of their political objectives? I think Archbishop Justin is right to say we seem to have done it once in the post-war period when some of the giants he was speaking of not only made it their quest, but also got a lot of political support for their quest. And this isn't a party political point, because subsequent governments, Conservative, also made things like one nation conservatism. Politicians like Rab Butler followed the same theme. It was going to be popular to have a goal, a quest for a really pearl beyond price national policy. How practical or impractical is this in the age of rather noisy democracy and the social media?
Thank you. Who would like to go first?
I think two of them were sort of more aimed, well, the second one, Charles Moore's, I think, was to both of us. The first one was to me. I think on the Brexit, Charles, I was very careful at the beginning of what I said, saying I wasn't talking about Brexit itself as causing my exasperation, but a way in which the debate took place. And I continue with that, exactly for the reason you suggested, that on one side it seemed to suggest the other side were just ignorant. And I think that ignored the reality of what was causing the desire for Brexit and the reasons for voting for Brexit. So I'm entirely agreeing with you, and I think the basket of deplorables is a deplorable term. I worked, and Caroline and I lived, and our children went to school in areas that voted solidly for Brexit for many, many years. And the key thing we do not do is listen to people whose voice we don't want to hear, and that is an increasing way in which we live. And nationalism and populism, the issue is not nationalism or populism, it's the policies that it may lead to. When it leads to nationalism out of fear or populism out of fear, rather than so that it is against the other, rather than inspiring an ambition for a nation or a people to care for and love the other, which seems to be much closer to our tradition. On disagreeing well, I think, how do we disagree well? We start by recognizing the humanity of the other. It is when in our debates that the other is seen as non-human, subhuman, unhuman, or just an argument rather than a person with passions and loves and hatreds and cares and concerns, that we lose the capacity to disagree well. I'll leave
The Pearl of Great Price.
I'll leave Miroslav to deal with the Pearl Beyond Price.
So maybe just a footnote, basically to agree with Justin on nationalism question. I think understanding is what we are called to show. I had some 20 minutes to make my comments, and some of these comments might have been a bit more pointed because they were short. But I think I very much understand, and I want to hear more what generated the sentiment. And I think we're far from actually properly understanding what gave the rise to, say, in the United States, to political prominence of somebody like Donald Trump. But I can understand that without agreeing with a kind of populist, exclusivist, nationalist kind of sentiment that is catching those and then articulating them. With some significance for the global affairs, I think. So that would be where I would come on this one. You know, the question of I use the metaphorically pearl of great price, thinking in terms of the vision of the good life, and I understand why in modernity there's kind of privatization of the good life has gone on, but it seems to me that something like soft relativism is also a vision of a good life. That is to say, what we have currently as underpinning our liberal democracies is the mode of the pearl of good price or of great price, or a certain vision of the good life. I think it needs to be recognized as such, and then we need to ask the question: does it take us where we want to be? And it seems to me that what we should do is then engage in what, when I teach the course, and obviously I know that life in a nation is not the same as life in a classroom, but what we described as truth-seeking conversation. So that we explore in a pluralistic way something that actually has a claim on our lives, and something that about which a lot in our lives is at stake, without necessarily wanting to impose that as an option. It seems to me that there are modes we should aspire to the modes of democracy, pluralistic democracy, which would allow us to place on the table afresh a question of the good life. I think it's going to be there. It's going to be there because of the vibrancy of certain religious traditions, and we better learn how to negotiate in this way, and I think it will be for the good.
Thank you. We're going to take some more questions. This gentleman at the back here, I can see a beautiful teal arm a few rows back, and the gentleman right at the back, and we're going to add Loretta at the front here, and that will be our last. So 4 questions. There, and then there. And again, keep them as concise as you can.
My name is Jeppe Hedder from Copenhagen, Denmark, and I'm really happy to be here and see your initiative, Justin. I'm the founder of Religion and Society, which is a gathering of all faith leaders in Denmark that are willingly now engaging in politics and engaging in the debate together. Where do you see Britain as a community of faith leaders working together in the future?
Thank you. To pass it back to the lady about 3 rows back.
Thank you. I'd wondered what colour it was. Archbishop Professor, thank you for a really, really interesting evening. Paula Venables from the Post Office, as well as the Church of England. The first responses you had to the questions as you sat down this evening was around how you transform Britain, how you reimagine it. And the Archbishop said you do that by courageous leadership. And Professor, you responded by saying that actually that is most successful when you take it out of a crisis, when you lead out of a crisis. My question is, within the UK, would a ruling party ever admit to a crisis to enable us to respond with that courageous leadership?
Thank you. Gentleman right at the back, and then we're going to come to Loretta at the front.
Other than Paul Beattie from Cambridge.
Do you mind just standing up, sir? Thank you.
Sorry. Other than a straightforward, well, it's both and rather than either or, can you say something about how you see the relative importance of trying to improve or correct some of the structures of our society with simply seeking to pour the love of God into each and every interaction that we currently have or might have or possibly should have? Thank you.
Thank you. And the final question here. Would one of you... There we go.
Thanks, Abby.
I'm Loretta Minghella, I'm a church commissioner. I have 2 questions, if I may.
They're brief.
Very briefly. So the first one is to the professor. You made a compelling case for joy, and for many of us here, not everyone I imagine, but for many of us here, our joy comes from our faith in Jesus Christ. Certainly the case for me. What's the public policy answer to your, to your argument for joy? Especially in an environment where we kind of disaggregate the person and say there are the things that you do and the things you believe, and we don't want to know about those things that you believe because we're a secular society. That's my first question. And to you, Archbishop, as you wrote the book, you came forward with many, many arguments about what might happen in the public square in terms of public policy. But as you wrote it, I wondered what you thought the message was for the church about the role the church should best play at this very crucial time.
Thank you. 5 questions. Don't feel like you both need to answer all 5, but please
That's very tactful.
address the ones that you
You're saying people want their
feel
supper.
drawn to. No, we're fine. We want to hear from you. Eeny, meeny, miny, Miroslav Volf.
Yes, okay. I'll be very brief, and I'll take two or one and a half of the questions. One was the relationship between structures and kind of love of God. I don't think there are alternatives. I think we need to pursue both. Structures have a way of insinuating themselves into patterns of our lives and our thinking, and the transformation of structures irradiates from the individual transformation. So I don't see them as opposed to one another. I see them working actually hand in hand. And on the question of joy, what kind of policy implication it has? So I'm familiar more with educational institutions. And it turns out that I teach at Yale, as in many places in this country also, highly intelligent people who come working very hard and studying their entire lives joylessly. I think something could be done in terms of educational experience and way in which your educational experience is structured, so that from the kindergarten on, even before kindergarten, I don't know how it is here, parents have harassed their offspring into a particular school, and obviously they've have joyless experience for the sake of having resources in order to live their dream that they have no idea what it is. This is a bit crass way of putting it, but I think it has implications of how we structure the educational pedagogical experience, how we conceive of entire educational effort, how it's connected with our economic prosperity or whatever else it might be. I'd bet you this would be a very significant discussion to have.
Thank you.
Where do we see the faith groups working together in politics? We actually see it in a number of particular areas, both around particular ethical areas where you see groups forming together in Parliament and working together across faith groups and influenced by faith groups, particularly around education, particularly around health and the beginning and end issues around the beginning and end of life, but also around disability. And those would be some of them. We also see faith groups very, very active around with political implications, although not often expressed politically, but every action we do in the polis is a political action, particularly around areas of extreme need, the running of food banks, the care for rough sleepers, there's cross-faith groups working on that very, very effectively, the issues around debt and household and family. And those are issues with family, with political significance. Would a ruling party, Paula, admit to a crisis? I don't think if admitting to the, I think ruling parties usually, at the risk of sounding slightly cynical, admit to crises in the first 6 months in office, because then you can blame it on your predecessors. Where they've just taken over from a different party. And otherwise, crises come because they're forced upon us. And then there is a forcing of admission, as there was in 2008-9. I think it takes huge courage in leadership to say, this is something in which we are called to struggle together, and that kind of leadership arises very rarely. I would argue we saw it with Winston Churchill, we saw it with Attlee, but there was a generation that was capable of it. We saw it in some of the leaders after that, and we've seen it since and before, but it doesn't occur the whole time. It doesn't grow on trees, and it takes huge courage. And the danger today is that any admission of weakness, any admission of crisis is seen as the prelude to a resignation statement, which is probably not entirely helpful. And the church role, well, you'd expect me to say this. I think the church has to demonstrate its confidence in the good news of Jesus Christ in speaking about who Jesus is and why we worship. Its worship itself has to be something that demonstrates joy and real engagement with issues, all the things you find in the Psalms, the joy, the protest, the anger, the lamentation, the celebration, the different aspects that we need to have in our worship, and that is not always typical of every Church of England service. And I think the church, in its engagement with people, has to demonstrate its own humility, its consciousness that it is not there to order, but to love and serve, and above all, its concern and compassion for those who are suffering rather than seeking to hold on to power, says he, sitting in the Great Hall of a 15th century palace. And on that note, I'm going to shut up before I dig myself any deeper into a hole.
I can see one of Justin's communication staff in the corner. I need to not look at that.
Beating her head against the wall. Yes, absolutely.
Justin, Miroslav, thank you so much. You've given us an enormously rich evening of ideas and inspiration on which to feast. We will also be able to feast on temporal food now. So please follow the staff through past the Great Hall. You'll be able to leave your coats because I gather it's warmer in there. You can buy a book on your way out if you wish. And there was one more thing I was supposed to say, which is at 9 p.m. there will be Compline in
or shortly after.
Shortly after 9 p.m. at some point. God's relaxed about time. We can gather together for prayer for those who would like to. And so to finish, please join me in an enormous round of applause for our two speakers.
And I'd like to thank Elizabeth very, very much for keeping us moving. Thank you. And, at the risk of appearing religious, which we always try and avoid in the Church of England, I'm going to say grace. Let's pray. Oh God, all we receive is from you. And in this country, and we receive so much. We are so grateful to you for the blessings you shower upon us. We give thanks for our food this evening, for those who've prepared it. We pray for those in need and suffering. Keep our hearts open and our minds and spirits generous. And strengthen us in our unity in your care and fill us with joy as we eat and feast together. Amen.
Amen.
Please do eat. Thank you.